in Ireland we have a diversity of honeybees. There are wild strains of sort of native black Irish bee, but there are also strains of honeybee that have been imported from Europe, often paler in colour. You've got hives down in the vegetable garden, yes, at the back?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they're still active.
Okay, but there are nests, the wild nests of honeybees probably around as well.
Oh, there is
Honeybees, there is only one species of honeybee, but there are 18 species of bumblebee in Ireland. You see the little, she's busy away at the back there. I can say it's she because male bumblebees are virtually non-existent at this time of year. They will be produced in the bumblebee nests later in the summer, and their sole job is to mate with the virgin queens that will be hatched at the end of the summer, who will then hibernate and then produce new bumblebee colonies next year. Bumblebees make little nests in old mouse burrows. So a bumblebee, she's a little bit lazy. She's not going to make her own nest. They will find usually a rodent's nest that is unoccupied. So there's 18 species of bumblebee in Ireland, but a huge number of them are very threatened. Their habitats have disappeared. And then on top of that, we've got 80 species of solitary bee. These are little bees that make burrows or use hollows in wood to raise their young. And these solitary bees, they're not colony bees like honeybees or bumblebees. The female solitary bee is literally solitary. She spends her entire summer looking for pollen grain. She gathers it all up. She goes into a hollow in a tree. She lines it with mud first, and then she builds a huge pile of pollen with a nectar spat all over that. So it's a big sticky mess of pollen grains. Then she lays one egg on that, and then she seals it up with mud. And then she carries on in that tube. She makes the next little cell, and she does the same, makes a big pile of pollen and nectar, lays one egg, seals it up. And so in a little hole in a tree, she can make about 10 little cells, each with one egg, and that little egg will hatch into a larva that feeds all the summer on those pollen grains and turns into a bee that will probably hatch the next spring. So out they will hatch and continue that species life cycle. So those 81 species of bee, I will show you some of their little burrows up in the woodland garden. So these solitary bees, they nest either in the holes in the ground like that, or holes that they find in timber. So when you're walking past that big beech tree, you'll see the dead wood inside. It's full of little burrows of beetle larvae, and those will then be occupied by solitary bees, and you'll see it because they block up the entrance with mud after they've built all the little cells. What you need to do is take your little electric portable drill, put in a drill bit somewhere between 4 and 8 millimeters in diameter, and just go around your garden, wherever you've got wooden fence posts, drill a couple of holes into it, about 10 centimeters deep, so about 3 or 4 inches deep into the wood. Little drilled holes like that will fill up with solitary bees. So the 81 species of solitary bee in this country, something like 35% of them are endangered in one way or another. They're losing habitat, they are disappearing. Some have already gone extinct, as well as some of our bumblebee species have become extinct in this country because they've run out of habitats. So this kind of a habitat, now not many of us have got a bit of woodland, but lots of us will have little patches of bare soil like this. And you can see how these tiny little burrows, they're exposed to the sun. That will get very warm in the day, and that will help baby bees hatch. Well, have you seen any bumblebees flying in and out? If you watch, you will see bumblebees flying in, and then they walk down a hole, and that's down the bottom there, they've got a nest. But beware of them, because again, if you sat on that entrance or sit near it, the bee will get upset, because she'll smell you, and she'll think you're a wild bear come to eat her baby bees.
No, just actually just now.
An important thing to know about insects is they don't see the world like we see the world. Insects cannot see the colour red. they're totally blind to that end of the spectrum. So instead they can see from the yellows through the blues to the purples, and then they can see beyond that into violet and ultraviolet light. So bee eyesight is shifted away from mammalian eyesight. Us mammals see something different, and then birds are exact opposite of insects. They can't really see the blues, they can see reds and oranges and almost into sort of infrared. They can see below the red colour we can perceive. So all these groups of animals, there is a reason why their vision is different. And one of the reasons is that flowers have discovered in evolution that they can put down pigments that we don't notice but sing out to the insects. So for example, a poppy is completely colourless to a bee because it can't see red, but the poppy is covered with ultraviolet reflecting pigments, so it actually is singing in a bright white ultraviolet. So a bee is seeing almost a glowing ultraviolet dot in the field that we think is red. So the bee is looking at something completely different. And when she's flying along, she sees these bluebells as bright ultraviolet lit flowers. So she can spot them from a long distance away. So bumblebees are attracted to these bluebells, and they'll always start at the base. So they start pollinating the lowest, they visit the lowest flower first. Now what that lowest flower has got is its anthers are completely withered away. It's finished producing pollen. It has got a stigma, the female part is ready to receive pollen. So that bee arriving, she's carrying pollen from the last bluebell she visited. So she gives it to that first flower, she transfers pollen. And so it's acting, if you like, that flower as though it's purely a female flower. But then the bumblebee, she drops away and she flies up to the next flower, the next one, the next one. And as she goes up, the very first flowers as they open are releasing their pollen. So they're acting like little male flowers, and they put all that pollen on the face of the bee so that when she flies off and visits the next flower, she's carrying the pollen from that flower to the next one. So it's an ingenious trick that Darwin realised that what is happening there is the bee is, in combination with the plant, ensuring that pollen is coming from a different plant, and then this plant is then sending its pollen away somewhere else. Because if it was the other way around, the whole thing would get self-pollinated. Luteum is an example of an azalea, which is the case where all the leaves are lost every winter. So an azalea historically was classified because, like rhododendrons, it produced the same kind of flower, but it lost all its leaves in the winter and regrew them each spring. So rhododendrons are related to the heather family. And heathers, like rhododendrons, have got a number of anthers, and they're very clever. The way they release their pollen is through just a tiny hole at the top of the anther. And we find the same thing in tomato plants and all of the solanums. So potatoes, tobacco, tomatoes have got flowers in which the anthers have just got a little hole at the end that drops the pollen out. And if you listen carefully to a bee visiting certain flowers, particularly the Solanaceae family, you listen to the bee, she arrives, and then she lands on the flower, and suddenly she goes, and what she's doing is releasing this very high-pitched note, so she's buzzing her flight muscles, but a bee can unhitch its muscles from its wings. So she unhitches her wing muscles, and then she buzzes her wing muscle, flight muscles. Very, very high-pitched noise. And the consequence is all of the pollen grains fall out of the anther onto her belly, and she scrapes them up and puts them into her little pollen basket. So on her hind legs, these bumblebees and honeybees have got little baskets of hairs in which because they comb the pollen grain off themselves, and just by the movement of their legs, all of the pollen is picked up into these little baskets. So when the bee returns to the hive, she has got two little lumps of pollen grains from all of the flowers she has visited on her flight away from the hive. And she pops them into a cell in the hive in which there's a larval bee growing. And that's where the protein that little baby needs comes from. if you were just raised on honey alone, you wouldn't get any protein. So bees have to rely upon both nectar to feed their babies, but also pollen. And then towards the later part, or in the early year really, in a honeybee hive, the workers decide their queen's not laying enough eggs. They're very critical of the queen, and within 2 years they've decided she's a bit of an old lady and they're going to replace her. They take some of the eggs and they start feeding them special queen food. This queen bread enables these, and it's fermented in the tummies of the worker bees, and they feed that to the larvae and it turns them into queen bees, egg-laying queen bees. The queen is aware of this and she doesn't like it because she knows full well that these daughters of her are possibly going to kill her or take away half her colony. So the workers constantly keep her away from these queen cells because otherwise she can rip them open and destroy them. And in fact, the first queens that hatch in these sort of swarming hives, sometimes those virgin queens will run around and sting to death their sisters before they're born, because out they fly from the hive. They go up into the sky where there are swarms of drones around, and they will mate not once, not twice, and we used to think 5 or 6 times. Actually, they might mate with 40 or 50 male bees up in this swarm just in a couple of hours. Then they come back to the hive and they're releasing this pheromone that all the worker bees say, right, we're going with this new queen, and off they fly and set up a new colony. And this can weaken a hive because it can throw many swarms in the spring. So the work of a beekeeper is really to ensure that there's a timely replacement of the queen, but at no point do your hives lose lots of workers because they're vital at that early part of the season. So again, the way that plants are involved with the life cycle of bees is very important to both sides of the partnership. And colonies of bees are remarkable for that sort of behaviour. Bumblebees have much smaller colonies. The whole colony will be the size of 2 large oranges or something. It's not particularly big, but it's in a hole in the ground that used to be a rodent burrow. So as to make one of these artificial burrows, all you need is to take a plastic flower pot, fill it with chopped up straw or hay or grass, and then shove a lot of netting underneath, sort of rabbit wire, chicken wire netting in the base of the flower pot, and then bury it upside down so that there's maybe some of the holes of the flower pot are just showing. That's the simplest kind of way that you can set up artificial bumblebee nests in your garden, or you can build fancier wooden ones. Again, like I say, there's lots of suggestions on the internet of ways to do that. And bumblebees are far more useful to our native plants than honeybees, because honeybees will often rob nectar out of flowers like red clover because they haven't got a long enough tongue.